fantasy short stories. Of Portals and Portents by Lesley Herron. Chapter 8, Chalcedony.
Maintaining current speed, your arrival time will be 4 days, 17 hours, 23 minutes. I suggest reducing carry weight to increase efficiency.
Vel shifted the unconscious woman on his shoulders, using his left hand to wipe the sweat from his brow.
If you tell me to leave her one more time, I'm gonna find a way to reprogram you.
After all the help I've been lately,
he growled, pulling to a stop near a large, flat stone that jutted out from between several trees.
Now that you mention it...
Vel laid the woman gingerly against the stone and stretched his back, shoving his knuckles into his lower spine to elicit a satisfying snap.
You usually only offer me snide remarks, so your helpful behavior lately has me suspicious. What are you up to?
There was a long pause.
Nothing.
Vel moved his hands to his hips.
Amy?
Very well. After your initial meeting with the Prime Minister about the portal, I began running scenarios. Your past behavior in certain situations have led me to the conclusion that you have little regard for your own mortality, and by proxy, my own.
He sighed.
A bit blunt, but a fair assessment.
Indeed. As such, with the increasing likelihood of conflict, I have been continually upgrading your systems. I have managed to enhance the vision in your left eye, adjusted the response time of adrenal glands, and boosted other beneficial augmentations.
He was busy testing out his vision by squinting close his right eye when something occurred to him. He glanced down to his left arm.
Is that why this healed so quickly?
Your wound has not healed at all. It has, in fact, been getting worse because you so stubbornly insist on carrying so much weight.
Vel shouldered off his coat, draping it over the woman to inspect the wound wrapped in elegant fabric. There was a large, growing stain in the middle of it, but he hadn't felt any pain since the injury occurred. He prodded at it gingerly with a mechanical finger to demonstrate the lack of response.
Then why doesn't it hurt?
Since you spend most of your time in a state of constant fight or flight, I have dialed your pain receptors to 0.
He grew quiet for a long moment.
Amy, you can't just go turning things off like that.
His voice was low and soft.
I was being helpful.
Vel growled, wrenching the bandage from his arm.
Turn it back on!
I do not understand. Why do you want to feel pain?
Because I'm not a machine.
Vel sank to his knees in the tall grass as one of his greatest fears reared its ugly head. When his brother had cobbled him back together, so much of him had been replaced, he barely felt human. If a ship was destroyed and all that was left was the helm, could it really be attached to a new vessel and be labeled the same ship?
I have to feel...
Pain was one of the few reminders that he was more than machinery.
I need to feel... something. Turn it back on.
Are you certain?
No!
The vision in his cybernetic eye glitched briefly, darkening around the edges before returning to normal.
Very well.
In a few days, he was sure to accept his decision as the right one. But at that moment, Vel couldn't have regretted anything more in his life. As a gentle warmth caressed his fingers, he readied himself for the pain. Instead, the sensation was replaced with indescribable agony, like he had grabbed hold of a live electrical wire. His body spasmed and convulsed as he collapsed to his side in the grass. But the last thing he glimpsed, before the world went mercifully black, was another glitch in his mechanical vision. Piper shoved her finger into the chest of a richly dressed man.
Listen here, jelly bean. Get out of this lifeboat or we're leaving you all behind.
My name is Geoffrey Gillicuddy VIII, and I told you before I am not moving until we are ready to reboard the airship.
He nodded vigorously to himself, as several others in the lifeboat chimed in agreement. There was a loud groan of exasperation as Piper pinched the bridge of her nose.
You mean the one that is currently smouldering and half sunk into the lake?
Of course that one. How else do you propose we get back to civilization?
Geoffrey pointed to the skeletal remains of the once grand ship, smoke still rising from its corpse.
All it needs is a few repairs and maybe a fresh coat of paint. I am certain the captain is seeing to it as we speak.
There was a painful spasm in Piper's left eye as she looked over at the lake. The ship had burned through the entire night, and there was nothing left but the twisted framework of melted copper and waterlogged charcoal.
You'd sooner get back to Avis by flapping your arms.
She turned towards where Captain Thorne was directing his crew to pack up whatever provisions and gear they had salvaged for travel.
I don't have time for this.
She exchanged a glance between the group of floaters and her brother.
Atticus, Unit 2, be dears and help these jelly beans out of their boat.
The robot tipped an imaginary hat.
Of course, Mum. We shall commence with rescue protocols immediately.
Nodding her thanks, Piper retreated back to the less muddy portions of the shore and strode towards the captain. She was tired of wrangling the gentry like livestock all by herself, and, although she may not like the man, he could command respect, even from the floaters.
Sir, a word, if you please.
The towering stick of a man turned just enough to acknowledge her presence. Yes?
I've taken it upon myself to try and organise the passengers, but...
She let out an annoyed sigh.
Many of them are recalcitrant and are refusing to listen to me. If you want them ready for travel, I could use your help. Or perhaps an high-ranking officer of your crew. Someone they would listen to.
Thorne turned the rest of the way towards her, raising an eyebrow. And why would I want them ready for travel? Piper looked around at the crew stuffing backpacks with the last of the food or fastening blankets filled with gear to poles to be carried between two people. Some were even distributing out firearms in a quiet and discreet manner. She closed her mouth, looking back to the captain.
Well, aside from the fact that the ship burned down...
Thorne pulled a face. Thank you for that, by the way.
Not my fault.
She cleared her throat with a purposeful cough.
Aside from that, you are obviously preparing to head out.
Yes, and anyone who is smart will follow of their own accord. Thorne pulled off his captain's hat to rub the sweat from his brow before replacing it neatly atop his head. I suspect maybe 5% of these passengers will even consider the possibility of venturing out with us, and even fewer will act upon it. Piper narrowed her eyes.
And you plan on what? Just leaving the rest of them to die?
He shrugged. Honestly, I don't really care. They could be just as safe here as anywhere, and I, unfortunately, do not have the manpower to babysit them.
At least let them try. Tell them the truth, and they may surprise you.
Surprise me?
Thorne barked a laugh. Wealth and station do not make an individual this clueless or insufferable. No, these are not titans of industry, scholars, or people of ambition. These are their children, those of generational wealth who were lucky enough to have been gifted their status by their forebears. He shook his head. It is the trials of life that allow you to grow and forge the strength of character to warrant your continued existence. The kind of people who dance among the clouds are ill-equipped to stroll the rocky trail of reality.
I may hate them.
A frown touched Piper's brow.
But they deserve a chance. At least leave some of the food. I'll stay and protect them if you won't.
She couldn't fight the glimmer of pride welling up inside her for standing up to the captain. But shouting from the lakeside pulled her thoughts from the good feeling, and she turned to see Unit 2 carrying the still-occupied lifeboat up the muddy banks of the water's edge. She let out a lengthy sigh. Her brother's attempts to coerce the floaters had been just as useless as her own. Thorne switched his gaze from the commotion back to the girl.
No.
No, you won't leave any food? Or no, I can't stay?
Both.
The captain folded his arms behind his back.
We will need your sibling's automaton, and from what I can tell, I am unlikely to separate the two, or you from his side. So, if you want a chance to survive this, I suggest you fetch the High Inquisitor and his pet.
He gave the girl a curt bow.
We depart within the hour.
Despite the boiling of her blood, Piper swallowed it down as she glanced over to Atticus. He was grinning ear to ear as he guided his robot to a level surface to drop the boat. A smile tickled at her lips when she overheard him speaking of sediments and quartz. She started to make her way towards them, then changed her mind and veered off the path in the direction of the tree line. She scoffed. A couple of years ago, she would have simply grabbed her brother, swiped some gear, and skipped out on the others, leaving them to fend for themselves. Perhaps it was Vel's chivalry wearing off on her, but this didn't feel right. She just needed a moment to think. As she neared a particularly large tree, ideas of crafting a makeshift sled or carriage floating around in her head, she heard a thunderous snap, followed by the creaking of wood. The earth groaned under the sudden shift in weight, and she lunged out of the way as the tree toppled over on the spot she had just been standing. Managing to roll away as it crashed into the ground, Piper stared at the massive trunk in absolute shock. Her eyes darted around, looking for the cause of its upheaval. Perhaps just erosion, or maybe the storm loosed the tree from its perch at the foot of a small stone cliff face, atop which sat a tiny red demon? Her mouth fell open.
Ha! See! Refugees!
Piper backpedaled, scrabbling away in the dirt as the little ball of fur hopped up and down, pointing a long finger in her direction. A jagged line split across the stone's face.
Rough, you jeez.
She gave a short scream as it lifted a titanic finger and pointed it at the camp. It was, in fact, a creature. With a rotund gut, tiny beetle-black eyes, and a mouthful of square, flat teeth, it looked rather harmless. Well, except for the fact that it was almost 14 feet tall and was wielding a massive metal I-beam in one hand.
We do good! Do good! Call for help!
The furry red demon hoisted a curved horn nearly the size of itself and shoved the small end into the stone creature's mouth. There was an explosion of sound that Piper could feel resonating deep in her chest, causing her heart to flutter in panic. But it wasn't loud enough to cover the sounds of bodies crashing through the forest in their direction. She watched a myriad of creatures, from fur-covered men with fangs to small reptilian beasts rushing towards the camp. It wasn't until she heard screaming that she was properly motivated to finally move. A massive hand plucked her from the dirt and spun her around. Piper found herself staring face to face with the stone giant, close enough to smell what the creature had eaten, presumably from the week before. She choked down the gagging sensation, clenched her metal hand into a fist, and let it fly, feeling it connect with the monster's nose.
Back off, ugly!
The creature held her further away, its mouth turning down into a frown.
Oh.
The little red demon scowled at her, narrowing its dangerous green eyes.
Mean girl! Put her in sack!
It was only then she noticed the giant had exchanged his weapon for a large, filth-stained canvas bag. Knowing what was coming next, she folded her arms across her chest and her face pulled down into an unmistakable scowl.
Damn it!
The morning sun beat against Pyra's face, bright light bleeding past her closed eyelids. With a groan, she gently cracked them open, taking in the fluttering leaves above her. Resisting the urge to return to sleep, she made to sit up, but every muscle and bone in her body cried out in agony as she moved. As she finally managed to sit upright, a wave of vertigo threatened to return her to slumber. She looked down to see that she had been laid out on a stone slab. A light chuckle escaped her lips. No wonder her every move hurt. She looked around, struggling to remember the previous night's events. She rubbed at her temples, trying to coerce a memory from her aching head. She was attempting to rescue people from the river? At first, she thought the event was merely a nightmare, but the more her mind cleared, the more she realized it had been real. She recalled a wall of water, and she rubbed her head once more. Drowning? And then nothing. Pyra looked back up. Around her was rich grassland, with occasional thickets and patches of trees dotting the landscape. It was familiar to her somehow, but her mind was too sluggish to recall anything more. One thing was clear, however. There was no sign of the river. How had she gotten here? All the way inland, sleeping on a rock in the middle of nowhere. She looked down to see a red garment draped around her lower half. Someone must have pulled her to safety. But why had she been abandoned? She noticed a depressed spot in the thick grass and found her answer. There, laying half-twisted on his side, was the prince.
Verin?
Pyra scrabbled off the stone, but her legs failed to hold her, and she collapsed hard on her knees. She cried out in pain, blinking away the tears before crawling through the tall grass. Her fingers pulled up clumps of dirt as she pulled herself along, calling out to him as she did.
Verin!
He wasn't moving, and there was a large stain of blood pooling from a poorly wrapped wound on his arm.
Oh no!
She pulled to a stop at his side and racked her brain for the medical lessons she had seen Eric teaching the local healers. Pyra wrapped her fingers around his closest arm, careful not to move it lest she reopen the wound. She couldn't feel anything there. Breathing fast, she laid her head against the prince's chest. There was no heartbeat.
No, no, no!
She pulled him onto his back and straddled his waist.
Come on, please, please wake up!
She placed her hands on his chest and pushed. Again and again she attempted to revive him with a steady rhythm, but there was no response, no gasp of breath or flecks of movement. Tears clouded her vision as her breathing threatened to catch in her throat, but she fought back the panic and remembered the next step. Pinching shut his nose, Pyra leaned over, placing her lips against his, and filled his lungs with the breath from her own. Vel woke to the painful sensation of air being forced down his throat. A jolt of adrenaline snapped him awake, and his panicked mind barely processed a female body sitting atop him. He coughed and hacked around her lips, his fingers finding purchase on her shoulders as he did. In one swift motion, he pushed her off him and scrabbled away. Pyra collapsed back into the grass, watching the prince struggle to breathe normally. She let out a sigh of relief and placed a hand on her chest.
Thank thee, Aura, you're alive. I don't know what I would have done if you had died.
Vel hauled in another hacking lungful of air as a frown tugged at his brow.
What?
His brain was slow to click on, the pain in his arm still resonating throughout him. Her hand fell away as Pyra's mouth fell open in disbelief. He could speak.
Wait, what's going on?
You tell me, lady.
Mel reached over to clamp his mechanical hand around the wound on his left arm. He looked up at her, that frown never leaving his face.
You kissed me.
The shaky smile on Pyra's face slowly melted as her cheeks grew red. Her mouth opened and closed several times before pulling into a grimace. Oh no. She had done it again. She hid her face behind her hands, letting out a long groan. You're not Verin.
Sir? Ma'am? Sir? Reports are coming in from the western fields, and...
Rasizi held up a hand, cutting off the goblin runner.
Let me guess. The terrain is altered, the houses are in shambles, and the kobolds we sent to live there are angry.
Yes, ma'am. Sir, ma'am.
She waved him away with a heavy sigh. The news hadn't come as a surprise. Something similar had transpired all throughout their lands. At first, she thought it might be a localized spell, magical retribution courtesy of the humans. After all, they had been forced to abandon Oxhand when Elias declared it and the surrounding areas the rightful properties of the Twisted. When Sabine, the Bandit Queen, had tasked her with settling this area, Rasizi was certain she could rise to the task with ease. She had been a general, after all. But the locals didn't take kindly to the appearance of monsters in the area. A very few farmers had chosen to stay upon their arrival, but the rest had shown their true colors and fled. Old prejudices ran deep, and an orc was still an orc, regardless of what the king declared. Their settlements had been beset upon with vandalism, theft, arson, and the occasional torch and pitchfork-style attacks by drunken hayseeds. Rasizi hadn't been alone in assuming this recent chaos was simply the next escalation. But from what her scouts had been reporting to her, the lands beyond theirs had been affected as well. Houses suddenly buried in the sides of hills, or farmers waking up to unknown flora and fauna in their kitchens. To make matters worse, entire crops had been lost, replaced with rocky terrain. It had been nearly 2 days since she had slept, her efforts focused on rescue and restoration. With so many displaced, they were having to repair any salvageable buildings and construct emergency shelters to house the many refugees, human and twisted alike. With a tired grunt, she hoisted a log into a nearby cart from a stack of freshly cut lumber. She reached for another one when an obscenely loud horn sounded from the forest. The deep resonance caused her body to tense up, and Rasizi let out an angry growl as she turned to see Grunch and Akaz leading a large group of gnolls and kobolds back into town.
Akaz! I am going to take that horn and shove it up your backside if you don't keep it away from Grunch.
She gripped a new log, ready to hurl it at the little imp, when she noticed each gnoll and kobold was hauling a human behind them, all tied up or tossed in sacks, save for one human who was riding on the back of a large metal golem.
We help! Found more! More!
Akaz hopped back and forth on the ogre's shoulders.
Did good?
Her anger snuffed out, Rasizi let out a long sigh. Her eyes moved across the sheer number of new mouths to feed and house. She cursed aloud, as if they weren't stretched thin enough already. She lifted a hand, waving it airily as she said,
Toss them in the old church with the others. We'll sort them out later.
The outcry from the humans didn't surprise her, but one voice forced himself to the front and demanded her attention.
I am Captain Thorn, de facto leader of this group. If you monsters have even a modicum of civility, you will release us and return our supplies.
Responding with a groan, Rasizi gave the man a withering look as she drew a knife. The man flinched, taking half a step back, but held his ground.
You are not prisoners, Captain.
She forced a toothy smile.
My misguided friends were merely trying to help.
She stabbed the blade into the binding, cutting him free with a rough tug that nearly pulled him off his feet.
Akaz, untie the rest and get these people out of here.
She sheathed her knife, turning back to her task.
I'm busy.
Thorn advanced on her again.
And our supplies will be added to our own stores and distributed among all the survivors of the recent tragedy, humans and monsters alike.
I'm afraid that's not good enough.
You demand nothing.
Rasizi whirled around and reached up, digging her fingers around his ear. She hauled him painfully down until she could hiss into it.
There was a time I would feed self-important pricks like yourself to the troops and let the hellhounds play with your skull. But we live in a new world with new rules. You crash-landed in my lands. That makes you my headache. I'm tired. I'm angry. And there are a lot more people to worry about than just your merry little band of troll droppings.
She shoved him back.
So, report to the church, and we will deal with you in due course.
Thorn stumbled back, clutching his now bleeding ear as he glowered at the orc.
Don't take it personal, Captain. She's just giving you a chance to grow. Build up some of that character you was talking about.
There was a burst of laughter, and Rasizi turned to see a young woman climbing out of a filthy canvas bag. She did a double take, and then shot a glance back at Thorn.
Are you an idiot? If you are in the company of the Queen, lead with that next time.
She let loose a backhand, slugging the man in the arm before she could think better of it. She turned to the woman, offering her a short bow before pointing towards the east.
Your Highness, if you are looking for the prince, he is helping with the reconstruction of the town hall.
The orc tossed another timber into her cart.
Now, if you would all kindly leave me alone.
Rasizi hefted against the handles and began pushing the cart down the street in the opposite direction.
I have yet another shelter to build now.
The red imp pressed his hands together in a pleading gesture, addressing Her Majesty.
Sorry. Did not know you was Queenie. No kill Akaz? Yes?
Piper raised an eyebrow when she realized the imp was speaking to her.
No worries?
Atticus leaned down from his perch on Unit 2 to whisper,
Piper, why are they calling you a queen?
She shrugged.
I always told you I was royalty. Maybe these people just recognize it.
Akaz bounced to Grunch's other shoulder and pointed a long finger at the captain and the others.
What you want to do with them?
Piper looked over her shoulder at Thorn, who was glaring in her direction.
Put them in the church, I guess?
A smile graced her lips as she watched their faces fall. Akaz hopped onto Grunch's head and shouted,
Move! Move! To the church!
Between the stone giant and the monsters, the best of Avis found themselves being forcibly corralled down the dirt road towards a cluster of rickety-looking buildings, though it wasn't without a cacophony of complaints. With a grin of pure pleasure, Piper watched the floaters as they were ushered away until she could no longer see them. The stuffy suits and fancy dresses weren't going to starve beside a lake, and Thorn was furious. She gave a happy sigh and swiveled on the spot, looking off in the direction the orc woman had indicated.
What do you say, Atticus? You want to meet a prince?
He nodded emphatically.
Would I? I've never met one before. Do you think he'll be like the ones in the storybooks, with a sword and all that?
With a shrug, Piper set off on the muddy path.
Maybe, but I haven't read many storybooks.
Oh! Atticus slid down the shoulders of Unit 2 until he was cradled in the machine's arms like a hammock.
You can borrow my copy of the Dragon Quest Chronicles. I have all 4 volumes.
He smiled as his mind drifted back to them.
Chester got them for my birthday last year.
It has princes and princesses and knights who are princesses but pretend not to be. He laughed. And of course, it has dragons.
It sounds exciting?
The thought of reading made Piper's brain grow sleepy.
And romantic.
Atticus lowered his voice conspiratorially.
One of the characters meets a prince, and then they fall in love, or something like that. I got bored in that chapter and skipped ahead.
Piper grinned as they reached a group of workers hauling wood to where a large building was being reinforced.
Well, maybe we'll meet this prince and he'll fall madly in love with me.
She placed her hand on her chest, feigning a swooning fit.
And he'll take me to his castle, and there I'll live the rest of my life as royalty.
She laughed at the look on her brother's face, before waving down a tall, fur-covered man with massive tusks jutting from his lower jaw.
Oh, excuse me. Hi, yes. I'm looking for the prince.
The troll pointed to a man struggling to hold a support in place as several workers hammered reinforcements around it. Piper followed the gesture to see her prince was shirtless, muscled, and sweaty. Her heart skipped a beat. He was everything she would imagine a storybook prince would be. The fluttering feeling inside her, that felt like she was flying, came crashing down quickly when the man turned in her direction.
Vel?
Her stomach twisted as she forced down a bit of bile. She never thought of Vel as anything other than a protective father figure. She screwed her eyes shut and rubbed at her forehead, struggling to scrub her earlier thoughts from her brain.
I think it's him.
Atticus squinted.
But he grew back his arm somehow.
Excuse me?
There was a tug at the tattered hem of her dress, and Piper spun, looking down to see a small sandy-haired kid, or an incredibly short man, looking up at her with dewy gray eyes.
Yes? Did you just say Vel?
We thank you for joining us for this chapter of the novel of Portals and Portents, Book 4 by Lesley Herron in this ongoing series available here on Tall Tale TV. You can find links in the description to where you can listen to all her books and novellas, with new chapters appearing as they are being written and recorded.
And then the White Knight, not the Black Knight, because the Black Knight is the bad guy,
Stop
see?
talking!
The White Knight goes and fights this demon-y thing, which I kind of imagine looks a bit like you, except way bigger and loads scarier. No offense. He goes to fight this demon thing and realizes that the dragon sword can't hurt demons. I mean, what a great twist, right? So then you think, oh no, what's he gonna do? So he pulls out the Ring of Borgenrog and banishes it. I mean, if it was me, I would have used the Jewel of Morkthal, but I guess he did it because he couldn't use that on the Black Knight in chapter 13 then.
Quench! Smash, little doggy human!
Smash. Combat mode initiated.
Never mind. Tell Akos more about story?
I mean, if you insist. So, like I was saying before, there's this Black Knight guy who you eventually find out is the White Knight's twin, but not until book 3, which that book is amazing.